Hello, and welcome to Season 2 of Your Art Sucks, a podcast that continues the fight against mediocrity in all forms of art. And this is Episode 2, Outsource Me, Mark Kostabi and Damien Hirst. In this episode, we will look at artists who have bragged openly about farming out their artwork and claiming it as their own creation. Yes, as ridiculous as this sounds, there are many artists who have, or are currently, selling work that they had no hand in producing. For me, this episode is one that will bring a multitude of questions about the world of art, and most of them aren't good. Like, just off the top of my head, I want to know, is the notion that an artist must produce every aspect of their art to have it considered an original creation even valid anymore? Or have we reached the point in time where art has become nothing more than a mass-produced brand for public consumption? Do artists even have the time to produce great work anymore, with their lives so wrapped up in self-promotion through the growing number of social media channels? While these issues are complex and contentious, and may ruffle the feathers of those I talk about today, I will do my best to bring about some clarity to these murky waters. And maybe, if we're lucky, by the end of this episode, we will conclude if making your own art is something only suckers still do. And my God, I hope not. But nonetheless, let's dive into this swamp. I think it's best to recognize that the practice of artists not creating their own works is not an act specific to the 20th century. History is littered with cases of legendary artists allowing students or apprentices to produce their work. There's even a name for this type of art. It's called the atelier system, and it didn't stop the artists from signing the work, done by others, as still original. But such works are considered to hold significantly less value than their counterparts. Here's a great example. Leonardo da Vinci has two versions of his Lansdowne Madonna. Historians know that neither one of these paintings is 100% Leonardo's handiwork. But one of them is, well, shall we say, more his than the other. I will put images of the two side by side in the show notes, and you can see that there is a difference between them. But to say one is more Leonardo is beyond my untrained eye. There would be those in the art world who would be very forthcoming and state that Leonardo was in the business of making art. And to hold on to the thought of him slaving over each masterpiece, centimeter by centimeter, for countless hours is just juvenile. He had to produce to make money. So if that meant him doing only a portion, let's say the key elements like hands and facial expressions, and handing it off to his assistants, then so be it. One could say that outside of the Mona Lisa's semi-smile or smirk or whatever it's been deemed, does anyone really give a shit about the rest of the painting? If Leonardo painted this key element, then all is good, right? Well, I have my opinion, and I'm sure you have yours. But let's allow ourselves to move forward in time. We all know about other artists who have used others to do their bidding. If you listen to other episodes of this podcast, you will remember that I spoke of Marcel Duchamp on a couple of occasions. The one in particular that is relevant to this show is the urinal that he simply signed and displayed as a piece of appropriated art. And remember, this work was considered to be one of the most influential works of the 20th century, as voted on by a group of art influencers at the time. So it appears that they didn't have any reservations that Duchamp didn't actually make the urinal, but claimed credit for it. Their response was, "This is revolutionary." I also mentioned in that episode, other artists came after Marcel and appropriated his work and continued to claim their version, which was just the same as the stolen work, was new and original. And for years this spiral went downward. If we look at more modern artists, we can see a long list of instances where art was completed by other people. If we are looking for someone who has no apprehension about letting others know that he subcontracts his work out, then we don't have to go further than Alexander Tarrant. While Tarrant has gone the traditional course of art school and worked his way through many creative ventures, he's come to the conclusion that his time is better spent coming up with ideas and marketing himself rather than be stuck in his studio painting. No, he would allow workers in a small village in China to do that for him. Now I could ramble on about other artists in this category like Takashi Murakami, He has a whole factory churning out trinkets and plush toys and cheap knockoffs of all his artwork, which he still maintains are his as he oversees the development. Hell, Murakami sees absolutely no harm in this process. He's quoted as saying, "Japanese people accept that art and commerce will be blended." And in fact, they are surprised by the rigid and pretentious Western hierarchy of high art. So, to me, maybe it's a Western ideal that art doesn't cross the line into commercial property. I mean, I'm not a cultural anthropologist, so I can't say what goes on in the West. What I can say is that the cat is out of the bag in today's art world, and there's no way we're going to stuff that guy back in. So let's dive into our first artist, Mark Kostabi. I believe this artist attempted to circumvent the art world at a time when such brashness was considered to be almost criminal. Okay, this story too is a little bit of a rabbit hole, so while I'd normally start with a bit of background of the artist to give you some perspective, I'm going to start with the simple statement that Kostabi made that will give you the gist of who he is. He says this: "Modern art is a con, and I am the world's greatest con artist." I can tell you that I first heard of Mark Kostabi in the 1990s when he was mugging it up on any TV show that would have him on. I was interested in his flashy style and the fact that an artist can be successful enough to garner shoulder rubbing with celebrities and dignitaries. This was all news to me at my young age. I was told time and time again that art was a life for the poor. Was it rewarding? Absolutely. But invariably, the artist's life was one where you had to accept poverty as a constant companion. Now, this wasn't meant to deter me, but more of a reality check. So, to see an artist shatter that conception was very freeing for me. To say I had a bit of a fascination with Kostabi was underselling it. The only problem I had was his work. To me, it was basic in its execution and didn't advance much beyond its surface. It's hard to look up to somebody whose work you believe is subpar. But who the hell was I? He was a very successful artist tearing up the art world, and I was some young punk who idolized the Sex Pistols, so maybe I had no taste. Now, the art world, in their constant need to define, speedily labeled Kostabi the next Warhol. Even though his work was more reminiscent of a mix of De Chirico's surrealist landscapes and maybe Keith Haring's figures, Kostabi wasn't a fan of his predecessors. He's actively quoted as saying that Picasso was only a minor artist. Again, his boldness, while ignorant, seemed to play well to the crowds, as the 80s me generation still held a little sway in the galleries well into the 90s. When asked about the hype he seemed to generate just at will, Kostabi said, "Hype is nothing more than validation of a half-assed work. Most artists have a lot of hype. I have a lot of paintings." Now, I'm not quite sure what he was getting at there, because really there was nothing but pure hype that drove the public to the galleries to see his work. Oh, wait a minute. Did I just say his work? Yeah, allow me to correct myself. In that same interview, which I believe was on 60 Minutes, I'm going to post a link to the video in the show notes so you can watch it as well. It's an absolute must-watch, so please check it out. So Kostabi says to this interviewer, the interviewer asked if he had painted it, and Kostabi says, very brash. He just says, "I didn't touch the brush or the paint or the canvas, but I painted it." When further pushed by the interviewer to explain what he means by that, he continues to say, "I have a large staff which executes my paintings, and they do all the actual applying of the paint. But I am the author, and I am the painter of the work." Now, this kind of goes back to the concept I mentioned earlier. It's like a production line approach to cranking out concepts and having an assembly line of worker bees complete the paintings. The artist signs them and feeds them to the adoring public. It's the classic churn and burn method. Capitalize on buyers while the market's hot. And while this may make sense in the world of consumable products, it doesn't make sense in a product that's meant to stand the test of time. So what was the big deal? Well, here is where Kostabi shoots himself in the foot, in my opinion. In that same interview, Mark is asked if all these works are his ideas. Basically, the interviewer is looking to add some sense of validity to the artist. He's trying to connect him to the finished product in some way. But He has a moment of sheer honesty, one which he should have used some of his savvy to dance around, but he says this: "My idea? No. This one I purchased the idea from someone else. You see, I pay for ideas where other artists just steal them." The interviewer is plainly smirking now. He looks at him and he says, "So if you don't paint the work and the idea isn't yours, people may ask, what do you do?" And here's where Mark Kostabi, he just completely invalidates himself and any relevance of his art. He says, "Well, I hang around and make sure things are running smoothly." Yeah, it was that bad of a response. But as the segment goes on, there's a moment where a real gem comes out of this interview, and it comes from the brains behind the operation. The one Kostabi is actually paying the $8 an hour for her concepts. Her name's Diana Gentleman, and she says to the interviewer, "I'm into the business of art, and he," meaning Kostabi, "is into the art of business." Now, to me, that sums up the whole experiment this Kostabi World Factory was. It was a way for Mark to use his skills as a salesman and leverage the hard work and creativity of others to promote himself. His quote-unquote paint-by-numbers work, as he called it, was nothing more than a way for Kostabi to circumvent the artistic process and become nothing more than a con man. He's famously quoted as saying the buying public wants novelty, and when they buy my work, they get what they deserve. This may be true. Maybe the buying public only care about the story behind the art. The actual art serves as nothing more as the impetus to a conversation where the buyer can state with some level of contempt that Kostabi's statement about the con of modern art is so obvious that I bought this work because I'm in agreement and I'm above such ignorance. But in reality, the buyer is nothing more than another trick, another notch in Kostabi's belt. Because you paid for the con, and at the end of the day, Kostabi only ever wanted your money. So what ended up happening to Mark? What caused the fall from the art world darling to now he's hosting a public access TV game show? Well, it isn't any one single thing. There were his financial issues when the bottom fell out of the foreign market, where Kostabi had licensed so much of his work for commercial use in product promotion. And while this hurt him badly, it was the loss of celebrity as the world turned on him that hurt him more. You see, his con game was much like a matchstick, and while it burned hot when ignited, it only burned for a short time. And in its wake, nothing more was left behind than burned bridges. His works were being returned as people felt that they didn't get anything more than some assistant's minimum wage paint by number. Worse was finding out and suing Andrew Behrman, a publicist who helped Kostabi gain fame in print and news, for selling Kostabi knockoffs. Andrew, with a former Kostabi assistant, they would make tons of these paintings and sell them for thousands less. It looks like someone conned the con man. In Kostabi's life, we see that the art world can become an environment where a snake oil salesman can dominate the market. But thankfully, this world is self-correcting, and the needle swung away from such spectacle in little time. Sadly, markets and trends are cyclical, and we continue to see conmen like Alexander Tarrant proudly claim his work as a product of commerce, and not any real desire to forge a new path or create a new movement that speaks to the current human condition. The funny thing is that most legitimate artists do try to avoid the world pulling back the curtain on their processes. And for a long while, English artist and collector Damien Hirst had the art world completely buying into his genius. So much so that in 2010, Hirst was named the most successful artist alive with a net worth over £200 million. That's an unheard of sum for an artist. For deceased artists, yeah, we can see that paintings go for hundreds of millions of dollars. It's ridiculous, but it happens. I mean, let's take a look at the Modigliani nude, who I believe it's up for auction soon, and that one's easily probably going to go for over $100 million. But for a contemporary living talent, it's an accomplishment for sure. And let's be clear, Damien is still, to this day, an art world key figure. Anyone who follows modern art would be familiar with him and possibly with the multiple times he was sued for plagiarism or being called out by other artists for using assistants to complete his work. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Well, let's dive in. Hirst was a bit of a rebel growing up, and his path through formal training was shaky, with an eventual placement in the fine arts studies at Goldsmiths in the University of London from 1986 to 1989. Here, he did work with other students to put on events that would showcase their work. While it didn't do anything for Hirst's entry of cardboard boxes painted with house paint, it did initiate a meeting between the very wealthy and influential art collector Charles Saatchi. It was in his second show where Hirst, seemingly inspired by his time working in a mortuary, displayed a work that showed a cow's head that was slowly being devoured by maggots in a glass container. It was titled 1,000 Years. For some reason, Saatchi immediately acquired this piece as he was astonished by it. And at this time, Hirst has said, "I can't wait to get into a position to make really bad art and get away with it. At the moment I did certain things, people would look at it, consider it, and say, fuck off with that. But after a while, you can get away with these things." Which, in the context of this show, seems like a very prophetic thing to say. Getting away with things seemed to appeal to Hirst from a very young age, and appears to have carried on throughout his life. Now, I mentioned the meeting between Hirst and Saatchi, and this wasn't just a case of replaying history. The relationship between these two is what allowed Hirst to become who he currently is. You see, in 1991, Saatchi owned a venue, the Saatchi Gallery, where he displayed the work he purchased. And with his infatuation with Hirst, he funded anything that Hirst wanted to create. It's important to note that such a relationship is like winning the lottery. It's that rare, and it's that lucrative. But for both of them, it worked out very well, as Damien's first real work was to be a critical success. Titled The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living, it was basically the specimen of a tiger shark in formaldehyde encased in glass. The installation was considered to be a piece of iconic British art in the 1990s. But here's the rub, and it's twofold. First, the originality of the piece was immediately in question. It appears that 2 years earlier, the Stuckism International Gallery in London showed work that was basically a shark suspended in a window near the gallery. It was credited to Eddie Saunders. So many in the art world believe that this was another case of conceptual theft. The second aspect we have to consider is what others would begin to point out in years to come. Hirst had no involvement in the creation of the work. The whole piece was assembled by MDM Prop Company. But this is just the beginning of Hirst being in the center of a storm of controversy. In 2000, Hirst was sued by a child's toy company for producing a very large sculpture titled Him, which was basically an exact replica of his son's Young Scientist anatomy set, designed by Norman Ems. 10,000 of these things are sold every year by a Hull-based toy manufacturer named Humbrol, and these things go for about 15 pounds each. Hirst settled this lawsuit by making payments to various charities. I just want to point out something here. In 2000, here's Hirst getting sued by a toy company for making a very large-scale version of their toy and passing it off as art. Now, to me, that just sums up everything Jeff Koons does. Here's a guy making millions upon millions for blown-up versions of toys. He's not getting sued, and I don't know how that happens, but anyway, I digress. In 2006, a graphic artist and former research associate at the Royal College of Art, Robert Dixon, alleged that Hirst's print, called Valium, had an unmistakable similarity to one of his own designs. Hirst's manager, he contested this by explaining the origin of Hirst's piece was from a book titled The Penguin Dictionary of Curious and Interesting Geometry, printed in 1991. The problem is that was the exact book that Robert Dixon had his design in. So much for his manager coming to his defense. It's tough to defend somebody by saying they stole this idea from a book, so it's not yours, to the person that had the design in the book. So the rabbit hole of plagiarism goes on from here as English poet Charles Thomson, he wrote an article which he cites 15 cases where Hirst stole his concepts from other artists. But this show is not about creating your own art, and one could say that stealing ideas is just what art has always been. Okay, that's a shaky argument, but let's accept it for the moment. Let's just say that all of these alleged thefts are the same thing as creating your own work. Well, I would say that I've been using these examples to give you some insight into his character, and more importantly, set the stage for what is a concrete example of brazen acknowledgement that his work was not made by himself. And this came with Hirst's creation of his dot paintings. Now, if you haven't seen these works, well, there's not much to say about them other than they're dots of varying size and color. Yeah, dots. And they're not like Seurat's dots or, any of the Impressionist version of dots. These are just dots. Makes me think of his earlier comment, though, about making shitty work and trying to pass it off, doesn't it? And it's not that Hirst just made one of these dot paintings. He's credited for having around 1,365 of these paintings in the art market. So how does one make over 1,000 dot paintings? Well, that's easy. You farm out the work to assistants. Yes, the same thing Kostabi did, rearing its ugly head again a couple decades later. Like I said, trends are cyclical. In 2013, Hirst openly admitted that he is only responsible for the first 25 spot paintings, and his assistants have done the rest. But he still told Reuters last year that every single spot painting contains my eye, my hand, and my heart. Sounds like Kostabi saying that he was the artist even though he didn't do the work, doesn't it? Well, here we have another funny coincidence, because it appears that Hirst, like Kostabi, had assistants that he was very proud of acknowledging for their involvement in his work. In Hirst's case, it was Rachel Howard. He said of her this: "She's the best person who ever painted spots for me. She's brilliant. Absolutely fucking brilliant. The best spot painting you can have by me is one painted by Rachel." Wow. The only thing missing here is the 60 Minutes reporter videotaping him. The similarities between Hirst and Kostabi do end at some point, though. Hirst is still a legend. His work has recently lost some value, that's true. Some say almost about 30% of the original selling price of just a few years ago. But there is no doubt that Hirst did not really suffer from his mass production spot paintings. The vital thing to point out is while critics may feel Hirst is nothing more than a peddler who has no defined style of his own, there are far too many collectors that would benefit from purchasing his work for years to come. Well, there you have it. Two artists who tried to leverage outsourcing to increase the production of their work, only to increase their bottom line. While both were very brazen about the act, and both used the controversy to further the narrative around them, they didn't come to the same end. So where does that leave us? To be sure, we can answer the notion that the idea that artists must create their own art is one that appears to be dead. Buyers, regardless of their knowledge of art or the future value of an artist, appear to be completely content with purchasing work the artist had no hand in. We also know that it's no longer a secret to be kept. Hell, artists today have no idea why anyone would be upset buying work made by some Chinese laborers in a small village. But the bigger question to me is, what do you think? Would you be okay being the next Mark Kostabi or the next Damien Hirst? Sure, the money they made would be a definite bonus, but would you be okay with people believing you're nothing more than a con artist or a hack? Could you live with the title of an artist that you didn't actually earn? I mean, I'm not sure that I could on a personal level. I don't know if I'd be comfortable being viewed in such a manner. But if I'm being 100% honest, there's a part of me that's not ignorant enough to believe that slaving over every inch of your work makes you any more of an artist than Hirst or Warhol or Da Vinci. If the art world is full of people wanting to give you money for a great scam, then who am I to call anybody a fraud? I mean, fuck, if somebody wanted to give me thousands or tens of thousands of dollars for a work I didn't make but called my own, then why the hell not? Is that being a sellout? Probably. Is that damaging to the world of art and the artists who are trying to push the medium forward in an honest and thoughtful approach? Yeah. But the only question I guess you have to ask yourself is what's more important to you? Is it originality or authenticity? Or is it shameless promotion for the sake of enrichment? I think that such questions are essential to ask yourself. You need to know what lies at the core of your soul in regards to what is pushing you to make art. You need to be brutally honest with what you're doing all of this for. Are you more concerned with running a con or building a craft? Either way you choose, it has its positives and negatives, to be certain. But there's good things to come out of this question, because when you do answer it for yourself, you can then begin to shape your art around this identity. Remember that art trends cycle from authentic to appropriation every couple of decades. So at some point, whatever path you choose to follow, be it shameless self-promoter or authentic artist, you'll have your day in the sun. So make the most of it. If that means shelling out your work to assistants to do, or if that means slaving over every inch. That's something you have to decide on what's best for you when you get your moment. I do hope that you found this episode interesting. I know I really enjoyed putting this one together. I'm very passionate about these types of issues in the world of art, as they tend to define the types of artists that succeed from decade to decade. So now I'm going to say to you the obligatory close. Stop listening to me and go pay others to make your art. Thanks.